covering the National Industrial Recovery Act, and it is probably one of the most controversial pieces of legislation enacted during the New Deal for a variety of reasons. And I'll get to some of those reasons when we get into discussing the opposition that FDR faced as president. Just to remind you, it established the National Recovery Administration, which is the agency charged with implementing the requirements of this new act. It required codes of fair competition among industries. That is, industries would get together and decide upon codes that would govern not only the cost that they would pass on to consumers, but also cover such things as hours employees work, wages employee work, and working conditions that employees would undergo. But the most controversial part of it was this one here, Section 7A. For the first time in history, the federal government recognizes and promotes the idea that unions can organize and bargain collectively. And this is a huge shift in the landscape in terms of federal involvement in the labor movement. And as I said, it was tremendously controversial, not only because of 7A, but because of these codes that are going to be implemented throughout the program. Another important piece of legislation was the Tennessee Valley Authority. The Tennessee River had a reputation for flooding and great destruction during heavy rains. And so it was decided that maybe in order to create employment for people, that there would be a series of dams that were built on the Tennessee River to control flooding. So that was one of the main aspects of the TVA, to control flooding within the Tennessee Valley. But there were a couple other elements in there that were rather interesting. One is that it would help in the production of nitrates. And for those of you who are not familiar, nitrates, they're used in the creation of explosives. And so there were chemicals within the Tennessee watershed that would allow that production of those nitrates. But the one that really kind of got people's attention was that the government went into the business of determining what it cost to produce electricity. Now, the goal of the government was to produce electricity that was affordable to many people. Now, up until now, the utility companies pretty much set whatever rates they wanted. And so what the government wanted to do was to create a yardstick, if you will, about what it cost to produce electricity and what was a reasonable amount to charge Americans for that electricity. This really angered the powerful utility company. They felt that the government was encroaching upon their right to make profits and that it was overextending its authority in the private sector. The other problem with the Tennessee Valley Authority was that in order to build these dams, people who had lived on this land for generations would be displaced. Okay, they would have to give up their land. Many people didn't want to do that. Despite the flooding, despite the dangers, they were tied to the land. And so eventually, even though the government offered them a fair price for their land, many of them were forced to move without their consent. And that also caused a great deal of controversy within the TVA. So here you have a piece of legislation that's designed to benefit the American people, but also it has some consequences that the American people and corporations have to bear. In order to save money, Franklin D. Roosevelt cut the salaries or reduced the workforce that saved over $400 million. Again, it was a budget-saving measure. So even the government now had to tighten its belt in this economic crisis. And the veterans were still there demanding their bonus be paid. Now, as you remember when I told you about Herbert Hoover and the way MacArthur handled the bonus army, FDR was facing the same serious situation. You know, how would he handle these veterans who were still demanding their bonus? He did a very smart thing. Okay? He sent out his wife, Eleanor, to meet with the leaders of the bonus army. Remember that TR is disabled. He has difficulty moving around. And he also doesn't want to be out there negotiating directly. And so he sends his wife, Eleanor, who is very empathetic to the plight of people, very understanding, and she begins to meet with the veteran leaders. And she says, you know, we understand your need for the bonus. However, we're going to provide you even something more important than a one-time bonus. We're going to provide you jobs and security. And so therefore, the veterans were told no for their bonus, just like Hoover had done, but the way that it was handled resulted in a different outcome. And as this cartoon shows, the Veterans Lobby, was shown the door by the FDR administration, but without any violence or any confrontation. And in fact, basically, many of the lobbyists found the same treatment. FDR was willing to promise them something in return for not facing a confrontation. The other thing that Roosevelt did is that the veterans who were out there near Washington homeless, he would send out supplies to them without creating any kind of publicity. He would provide them with blankets, with food, with shelter, even with some kind of financial help if they wanted to go home. So he did this behind the scenes to reassure veterans that he was not insensitive to their plight. This photo was taken by a very famous photographer. Her name is Dorothea Lange. You may not know who she is, but you may know one of her most famous photographs, The Migrant Mother. This photograph, by the way, has been colorized. But it kind of shows the irony of living in the United States in the 1930s. Okay? And notice what the sign says, that people are queued up in order to get some kind of assistance. It's sort of a kind of a mocking reminder of how far the United States has collapsed because of this Great Depression.
They're standing in front of me.
Yes. Because they're waiting to get into some kind of relief from local charities. So it points to the fact that Americans need to go to work. And so the first thing that is established is the Civil Works Administration. And because winter was coming and people really desperately needed funds, the CWA was designed to provide immediate work to people. Because there wasn't a well-designed plan of what kind of work was going to be, people were given all kinds of silly jobs. For example, some CWA workers were hired to stand in front of public business and shoo pigeons away. Others were required to, rake public parks, put them in bundles. Somebody would pick them up, and then a third one would dump the leaves again, and another group would come by and rake them up again. But, people thought this was absolutely ridiculous. But Roosevelt said, look, at least they're working for their money. We're not giving them a handout. We're maintaining their dignity. And so therefore, yes, the work may be silly in some ways, but nonetheless, it gives them a sense that they're working for their money rather than receiving a handout. Okay.
Wasn't the CWA, like, they did sidewalks and stuff too, didn't they? Like,
no, they do not. This is just temporary work. There's going to be another agency that's going to take over construction projects. And I'll talk about that in a little while.
All right, sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. Well, we're there. The WPA, the Works Program Administration, which was established in 1935. This one had the whole idea of providing people with not only training in the skills that needed to build and construct, but also to help communities develop their infrastructure. And so the Works Program Administration, or the Works Project Administration, provided money for major construction projects, such as airports, public libraries, schools, sidewalks. In fact, if you walk along here in front of the Douglas building, if you look down on the sidewalk, the sidewalk has a stamp that says WPA.
Yeah.
That was laid in the 1930s. Most of those sidewalks don't have a crack in them, as opposed to the modern sidewalks Over by education that were laid by, and this is no criticism of the facilities management, they have cracks, and they were laid in the 80s. Okay. So the WPA provided some substantial work for people. It provided long-term employment. It provided long-term benefits for Americans who helped with these construction projects. As you can see here, it provided 10 million jobs for people. And it included a lot of different groups, not only men capable of and willing to work, but also young people and women. Now, this was interesting because most women were not allowed to work on New Deal projects. There was this old-fashioned mentality that the breadwinner was the male, and that if you gave women the job, it would take jobs away from the breadwinner. So not all women benefited from their participation in the New Deal because of gender ideas about what the proper role of men and women was. They also built dams and playgrounds. And they hired people who were not necessarily people interested in physical labor, who did not do, but there were artists, there were musicians, there were actors, there were all kinds of people who didn't work in the traditional trades. And so therefore the WPA also offered jobs to artists who began to create posters, not only for the New Deal, but also for communities. And so graphic artists were employed by the WPA. Playwrights were also hired to write plays, and actors were paid to act in those plays. And as this chart shows you, this is the number of people employed by the WPA in the different professions, in education, miscellaneous, practical arts, and fine arts. One thing that the New Deal did was to hire people, historians, for example, to travel throughout the country and to take oral histories, so that the history of those people would be preserved. And so today, if you want to know more about the experience of African Americans before the 1930s, there is a treasure trove of oral histories that were collected by New Deal historians and stored in the National Archives. The other thing that people did was they went out and they preserved native cultures such as Indian art crafts, Mexican folk culture. They encourage people to keep their cultural heritage alive by promoting the use of folk art and folk music as well. Yes, Mr.
I just wanted to ask, is this about the time that they started going like into the Appalachians and recording some of the folk musicians there too?
They did. They went and recorded the music because they didn't want that music lost. You know, and again, if you go to the Smithsonian, for example, you can buy some of those collected works from the musical collection. They're really treasures, actually. And then they also paid photographers like Dorothea Lange to go out and photograph the American landscape and the American people. And again, you know, it preserved a very important aspect of American life. Mr. Wheeler?
For a category of people such as artists, right, were they paid sort of unilaterally across the board, or was it based on the quality of their product in terms of art, photography? I'm just curious how this worked from a financial standpoint.
There was a standard to be paid. One thing that the New Deal did was it said, you know, it was New Deal people were not to be paid more than the prevailing wage. So that if there were jobs in the same field that paid more, the New Deal was not to compete with them. Okay, and so there was kind of a standard wage set. There were differences. For example, people who did murals. If you go to some library, post offices today, you see these wonderful murals that were done. They were done during the 1930s by muralists who were hired by the WPA to do that. They were paid more because of the level of work that they were required to do.
Was there anybody that kind of rose to fame out of this?
Oh,
Was
what?
there anybody that kind of rose to fame out of this? Like, was Garcia one of these?
Garcia was one of them. Another one who, by the way, received funding was John Steinbeck.
Wow.
You know, and they produced plays that were very controversial. In fact, the WPA hired a lot of black actors, musicians, and writers to produce plays for the African American community. And some of them were quite militant in terms of their criticism of racism and living in American society, which drew fire from conservative circles saying that the New Deal, was stirring up class hatred. So not all of these programs were very popular with the American people.